this presentation a lot in a variety of venues. Most of the time it's been for educators. I'm going to share with you a little bit by way of introduction about who I am. So I'm the author of 3 books, and I've worked in a variety of roles as a social worker. I've been a school social worker. I worked in a prison. I've been a family advocate. I did a good portion of an LCSW intern before I was offered a job to teach college and direct a social work program in rural Nevada. I currently live in Las Vegas. I've owned a business teaching court-ordered domestic violence classes as well as parenting, and facilitated a teen treatment group in the inner city of Las Vegas. So I've had a variety of experiences that maybe qualify me to be the one talking, but I'm also aware that the majority of you have variety of experiences and you could very well be sharing with me. But the thing that I feel qualifies me the most is not anything to do with my education, except for the education that I got from this little guy. So this is my son, Spencer, and I'm going to be talking about him because I swear this guy taught me more about autism than any of my professional roles. And he was my motivation to learn about autism. I kind of went to grad school partly just because I wanted to better understand this kid. And so being the mother of a child on the spectrum, I feel is what qualifies me the most to be talking today. I wrote a paper that was published in a professional journal, and basically the purpose of this paper was to help other parents recognize what autism is all about. And this is a quote from that paper, that mothers recognize early on something's not right with their infants who might be diagnosed later. And one of the things I want to really focus on today is the fact that not everybody gets diagnosed. I recognized early on, I'm telling you, the moment of Spencer's birth, I could tell there was something different about this little guy. He was not my first rodeo. He's right there in the middle. And I had 4 children before him, 2 more after. My husband and I are some of those bizarre people. We've had 7 kids together, just he and I. And so I had 4 fairly neurotypical children before Spencer came along. And at his birth, he looked around like, what is going on? He didn't cry. It was just very different from all my other birth experiences. He was happy to be wrapped up in a blanket and handed to me, but his attitude was kind of, well, this is fine, but I'd be okay without it too. One of the professionals out there has been known to say high-functioning autism is argued to not necessarily be a mental health disorder, but merely a style of cognition or a way of being that's different than what is considered normal. So that whole idea, normal is obviously a setting on the dryer, and but there were things about Spencer that I noticed early on. So I took him to an amusement park. He detested the people walking around in costumes, but he didn't mind a statue of something interesting. He loved to wear costumes himself and pretend to be something else, to play a role. Some of the other common traits that we see in people on the autism spectrum include superficial friends. They don't always understand friendship. And so what those of us who are more neurotypical might think of as an acquaintance, they will think of as a friend. A lot of awkward movements, maybe, monotone voices, intense special interests. For Spency, it was Buzz Lightyear and Spider-Man. And I'm telling you, I taught him how to read by reading Spider-Man comic books to him. That if I appealed to his special interests, then I could achieve more than if I didn't. He has 2 fairly neurotypical little brothers who in some ways were more advanced than he was. In fact, the little boy in the blue, Spencer's younger brother, taught him a lot about how to read. In fact, Spencer was late in learning how to read, but Drew learned earlier than he did. And Spencer was very intelligent, and so he kind of hung on to what Drew was learning and then mimicked it. So we thought that he was further advanced than he was. And this is also an attribute of children on the spectrum. So patterns of behavior and systems are prevalent even as they demonstrate more mature skills. So even as he got bigger, as he got into school and started showing that he had abilities beyond maybe what we thought he was capable of, in many ways he was masking what was going on underneath. And so he would still be immature in his interactions. He didn't understand things like style when he got into junior high school. So his little brothers would dress him for school in the morning. He knew it was important, but he didn't comprehend it in the same way that they did. Luckily for Spencer, and I had several professionals when I was in the throes of raising this little guy, I had several professionals that told me what I was doing instinctually was probably the best thing that could be done. Raising him in a family of fairly neurotypical people, a little bit on the spectrum, many of us, but dedicated to each other, wanting to help each other achieve. He had older sisters that were there for him and taught him a lot of the social skills he would need. And he learned them more by rote than maybe by the natural way that a more neurotypical child would. His older sister, Sierra, would take him on special dates and teach him how to open the door for a girl and teach him some of these, mannerisms that many of the rest of us just kind of take for granted from living in part of a culture. And he had to learn those. One of the things that we learned early on is that we needed to say things to him in a very plain way, and had to be an example for him of how things were in our little subculture of our family. So as we understand the symptoms of high-functioning autism, we're going to enable the parents, the sisters, the teachers, the clients that we work with, anybody who's working with these children, and if we're the professionals that are working directly with them, we're going to be able to help them more by creating an atmosphere at home. Even it's through teaching your clients how to create an atmosphere at home, which will help them best learn to function as independent adults. So one of the things that I often would tell my clients, and I worked a lot with parents of autistic children, obviously, and one of the things I would like to tell them is, remember, you're not raising a child, you're raising an adult. Your long-term goal is an independent functioning adult. Now, obviously, if you have someone who's nonverbal, if you're working with someone who is more on the spectrum, not as high functioning, then that can be more challenging. However, we still want to give them some skills. We want them, even if eventually they're still in a shared home environment, we want to have them we want to make sure that we empower them with some skills that will help them function as independently as possible, even if it's still living in their parents' basement or in a shared housing situation. One of the things that worked in our family was music. And I actually have a daughter now who's an LCSW who works pretty extensively with individuals through the use of music in therapy. And this became one of Spencer's special interests. In fact, right now I would say it is the special interest. But giving these individuals something that they can focus on that will empower them, and through this special interest, they can actually create connections socially that maybe they wouldn't have been able to otherwise. I love this quote. These individuals can be bright and creative, but they need to have their interests piqued and they need to be stimulated to learn. So that's part of the reason I would use the Spider-Man comic books to teach him how to read. He didn't care if it was Dick and Jane, who cares about that? But Spider-Man, I want to know about that guy. Music was something that was so empowering to Spencer. It was another language, and it was a language that he was capable of. It was something that helped de-stress when he'd been through a rough day. He would come home and pound out songs on the piano or on the guitar, and I could tell it had been a rougher time by how long he spent on a musical instrument. One proposed solution is don't waste a lot of time and money pushing kids in directions they don't want to go. Instead, find out what weirdness they excel at and encourage them to do that, and then get out of the way. There's so many wonderful young autistic people on TikTok right now that are empowered by that diagnosis. They recognize this gives me kind of a special superpower, and they have a whole new way of looking at it than maybe my generation did. One of the ways our family might not have done as well with this particular skill is my husband is a marathon runner, and he challenged Spencer at age 13 to run a marathon. As you can see by Spencer's face, now this kid, his emotions are all right here. He shows them. He did not appreciate running a marathon. Dad bribed him. I think he gave him $100 if he would run this marathon. And he was 13 years old. It was one of the hottest marathons ever run, or in that particular marathon, it was one of the highest temperatures that marathon had ever been run at. And so he was fairly miserable. He has run one marathon, but the music thing has stuck. There's a range of behaviors that can show symptoms of autism spectrum disorder. And this is one of the big concerns I think all of us as professionals should have, is that there are children who will be missed in the diagnosis process, especially high-functioning children. And according to a lot of the literature, especially girls, females, are often missed in the diagnostic process because they don't exhibit the symptoms the same way boys do. And it's easier to miss. They're able to mask them perhaps easier. To have a system of support is so important for these individuals and for them to feel like they're supported. I just finished reading this book in a different key, and this is an amazing piece of work that basically tells the story of autism. And I like this quote. The story of autism is actually many stories set on different continents and overlapping in time and circling back on one another. Ideas cross-pollinate, major players make cameos in one another's stories, and entire storylines unfold at different paces, thousands of miles apart. And yet, as much as the story zigzags or circles back, there's an unmistakable forward movement. Over time, because of the efforts made by parents and activists, public attitudes toward people given the autism label have moved in what all would agree is the right direction. The cruelty and neglect that have marked the history of autism now seem antiquated. More and more, a new impulse has taken hold. The impulse to recognize the different among us as part of us and to root for their full participation in the world. That project, of course, is still a work in progress, but it puts us all in the middle of the story right now. I love this book, and I had to include that quote because I think that recognizing and empowering individuals on the spectrum and not paying attention to a label as being a negative thing, but creating a label that's an empowering thing is what our goal should be as mental health professionals. So there's 3 areas I really want to focus on in this presentation, and that is these 3 different ideas. First, that individuals on the autism spectrum are different, not defective, but different. I love the TikToks out there that say, I'm not going to be cured. There's not a cure for autism. This is kind of a way of being. I love that attitude. The second thing is that these individuals cannot be changed. If you're trying to change someone you care about, maybe it's time to get into a 12-step program and recognize that it's not our job to change others. It's our job to support them and empower them to change themselves. And the third thing is that individuals on the autism spectrum can achieve their highest potential within a framework of support. So that first point, individuals on the spectrum are different, not defective. Tony Atwood has been a real pioneer in helping us better understand and empowering me as a parent. I got a hold of his books and videos years ago, And then I was invited to give a workshop at a conference where he was the keynote, and I was just so thrilled. If you don't know who Tony Attwood is, look him up. He's an amazing individual. One of the things he said is that people with autism spend more time doing things they are not good at than anyone else. And I think that is an important concept. Can you imagine trying to do something you're not skilled at all the time? Autism in the media is something that I feel can be incredibly empowering. This term Aspie, so we don't use the term Asperger's anymore. And I'm sure you probably all know the reason behind that is because it was discovered that Hans Asperger actually sent a few children to the gas chambers when he was working in under the Nazi regime. And so we don't want to honor Hans Asperger with using that term Asperger's syndrome. So in the DSM-5, we no longer have an Asperger's diagnosis. We call it high functioning autism. Autism, if you find out that someone has that diagnosis, or if you diagnose someone, obviously our reaction is not going to be pity. These individuals are pretty awesome. Thank you very much. And this is a picture of an actor named Max. He also plays the role of a child named Max in a television series. And it is a wonderful series. It's called Parenthood, if you're not familiar with it. I'm going to share several characters and or actors that have been diagnosed, famous people that have been diagnosed or have exhibited symptoms of autism spectrum disorder. If you recognize this guy, you're a fan of the middle. This is Brick, or the character is Brick. The actor does not have autism. He has another disability, but he does not have autism, but he plays the role of an autistic kid really, really well. If you're familiar with this guy, then you probably have teenagers or young adults in your home, or you are one, or you're a highly intelligent person. When I've taught high school and young college students, it's interesting. I will ask them if they're familiar with this guy and with the television show, The Big Bang Theory. And it's really interesting how it's the highly intelligent kids that are familiar with it and that enjoy it. And so there's a lot of high intellect stuff that goes on, and it's just fascinating to watch the autistic attributes go around. If you're from my generation, you recognize this guy. And I grew up with big brothers. I came after 4 brothers, and they loved watching Star Trek, and they were Trekkies. Does it run in the family, you think? This is a movie that was made about an autistic couple that definitely illustrates. This is a movie that was made about a famous musician that exhibited some of the symptoms. I love this movie. Okay, this movie, it received an award for being the worst movie of 2009. Sandra Bullock's character plays the role of a girl/woman who is obsessed with a guy. The guy's her special interest. She exhibits so many autistic qualities, and it's really hilarious. And it's interesting. I'm so glad that the media thought, oh yeah, let's put a girl out there in this role, because so often who we see as people with autistic attributes are guys. And guess what? Girls have them too. You're probably familiar with this movie. And this character exhibited a lot of traits of someone with autism. This is a series that is currently on Netflix. This is I really recommend this series. It's very empowering for people who don't understand autism and want to understand it. It's empowering for people who care about someone who's autistic, or for individuals who have not yet been diagnosed, not sure if they're on the spectrum, and for those who have been diagnosed. It's just a very empowering program. This is a HBO series that came out years ago. If you're not familiar with it, get out from under your rock. This is an incredible program. This is so empowering to mothers of children on the spectrum, and especially to the older generation, to really understand what it's like for these individuals. Temple Grandin, Claire Danes is the actress here, and she plays the role of Temple Grandin, who has changed the world, not in spite of her autism, but because of it, and she gives full credit to that. She's an amazing individual. One of the things that Temple Grandin has said is, what would happen if the autism gene was eliminated from the gene pool? you'd have a bunch of people standing around in a cave, chatting and socializing and not getting anything done. I love that quote. Temple's an amazing individual. If you are familiar with vampires, several years ago, Stephanie Meyer wrote a book that went crazy. And I don't know if Stephanie Meyer has ever been diagnosed or considers herself on the spectrum at all, but she's an individual that was capable of creating an entire culture in her mind. She created, and this is something that's very indicative of someone on the autism spectrum. They might not fit in as well socially. They don't understand social cues, but they're very interested in them. And they're very interested in understanding how people interact with each other. And so Jane Austen, Carl Johnson yesterday in his presentation about having the courage to speak out as social workers. Thanks for your presentation, Carl. You mentioned Jane Austen, and there are a lot of experts out there who have studied Jane Austen herself. Not necessarily the books she wrote, but Jane Austen herself and her way of being. She was someone who studied individuals from afar. She didn't participate as much in the social interactions as she was sitting apart and observing. And what's so interesting is that if you look in almost every book that she wrote, there is a character that is very much on the spectrum. We'll talk about some of them. Love Jane Austen. Very empowering to think of someone like Jane Austen as being on the spectrum. Okay, the second point I want to talk about is that these individuals cannot be changed. If we try to change them, we are just barking up the wrong tree. We know some of the causes that are out there. This myth that environmental factors could affect it. There is a hereditary component. Obviously, opposites attract, like attracts like. So more neurotypical people are going to be attracted to those on the spectrum, but also people on the spectrum are going to be attracted to those on the spectrum. So we're going to reproduce, and there's going to be more people on the spectrum. But it is not caused by emotional deprivation, by immunizations, by bad parenting. I get a lot in rural Nevada. I get a lot of clients that want to believe it's caused by immunizations, that getting a shot can cause autism, and that has been debunked. The doctor that did the fake study lost his license. So when these individuals are with their child on the spectrum, kind smiles are appreciated. Parenting advice is not. Here's some of the famous people that I have, they haven't all been diagnosed, but a lot of them exhibit the attributes of someone on the spectrum. And I find it very empowering when I work with parents or children who are on the spectrum to let them know all of the different famous people or the characters in television programming that exhibit attributes of someone on the spectrum. When I took Spencer to see The Social Network when he was 13 years old, we went on a special date, and he turned to me halfway through the movie and he said, "Mark Zuckerberg has Asperger's syndrome, doesn't he?" Yeah, at the time, that's what we called it, and he was very observant about that. Paul Collins said that autists are the ultimate square pegs. The problem with pounding a square peg into a round hole is not that the hammering is hard work, it's that you're destroying the peg. Yeah, we don't need to do that. Teenagers become more aware of their impaired social skills and more concerned with social situations as they age. Now, they might not always understand the social situation, but they're still very much capable of feeling the pain that comes with being ostracized. So that's an important concept to comprehend. The third point I want to make is that individuals can achieve their full potential with support. And I think that's a very important point. And how do we do this? How do we provide that support? We appeal to those autistic attributes. So I created an acronym. This is Spencer. These SPENCER. The first one is sensory sensitivities. Okay, we don't excuse when our child has sensory sensitivities, we want to acknowledge it. We want to validate that they're struggling, but we don't want to make them feel bad about feeling bad. So when Spencer was 3 years old, it took us hours to get him out the door because we had to put the socks on and had to line up that little seam until we discovered seamless socks. But we had to line up the seam and put it on correctly before we could pull the shoe on. A slight bump by one of his brothers, he would interpret as, he would say, "Drew hit me." No, Drew didn't hit him. He just bumped into him. So, and that can be really confusing to caregivers when a kid on the spectrum reports being bullied. Is he being bullied, or is he interpreting behavior wrong? Obviously, we want to make sure that there's not bullying going on. Fluorescent lights that I had one mom, every time she took her 2-year-old to Walmart, the little gal would have a major meltdown. And what we finally figured out is that with the fluorescent lighting, from the child's perspective, that might come across as like flashing lights. Whereas for someone who's more neurotypical, that's just light. I also, when I was a school social worker, I had a teacher that asked me for, I know I have a kid coming into my classroom who has already been diagnosed with autism. What can I do? And I'm like, okay, let's get rid of these fluorescent lights, first of all, and bring in some lamps and, just calm down so that we don't have that same kind of stimulation. A child, some kids do not want any physical touch. When Spencer was a baby, I instinctually, held him a lot, cuddled him, and then, I'd lay him down in his crib and he would be almost relieved. Yay, get that lady away from me, kind of thing. It was very different than my other children. And, I kind of trained him to appreciate that appropriate physical touch, but he still kind of just endured it. It was really interesting. Tony Atwood said that people with autism spectrum disorder don't suffer from the disorder, they suffer from other people. I thought that was a good one. Their pragmatic skills are impaired. So remember SPENCER, this is our P. Pragmatic skills. They see language as a way to share information. They want to receive that information correctly, succinctly, without emotion. We would talk at the kitchen counter for hours, just helping Spencer interpret what went on in high school that day. They might use dialogue from pop culture to communicate. Spencer got into acting. He was in a lot of different plays in high school, and now that he's in college, he continues with that. And he loves being on a stage. Those pragmatic skills, he loves interpreting language the way he's seen someone else do it. He might not be able to do it as well himself, but he can see how other people have done it and mimic that in a way that's just remarkable. Some of these individuals, I have a nephew who was diagnosed early on, and he was hyperlexic. He was so fascinated by words, by letters. So with these individuals, we challenge them to memorize. We provide these musical theater and nonfiction books to help appeal to that. So one of the ways that this isn't just an illustration. If you say, "I laughed my head off," a person on the spectrum is not going to comprehend that. That just makes absolutely no sense, and it's useless information. So they need that support, but they also need to be the one to provide support for others. So we want to give them opportunities. They want to kind of be the velociraptor, be the one that they know everything. They want to be the center of attention on the stage sometimes. So we need to provide opportunities where they can also be in the role of supporting other individuals as well. I was just reading last night about how so many of these individuals get misdiagnosed with narcissistic personality disorder. We got to make sure if we're looking, especially when they're younger and developing their personality, that what we're seeing in their behavior could be autism spectrum disorder. So E, that emotional connection can be impaired. Spencer wasn't born with that sixth sense that most of my other children have. So if you can't teach one of these individuals to emote, you appeal to their other senses. you appeal to that whole idea that there should be rules. And so we have rules in conversation. We have turn taking. We help them see from another person's perspective by role playing and going over what happened, where you put yourself in the role of what he could have said, have him play the part of the other person. They can be overly dependent on a caregiver. And obviously, I've known couples that have had one of them has been on the autism spectrum and the other one does a lot of the social support, but they get something positive out of the person on the spectrum. Maybe that person on the spectrum is capable of a job opportunity where they can make a really good income because they're fascinated by computers and they speak computer really well. But then they have someone who can provide the social connection for them and that kind of support. So point out how the individual slips up in a succinct way. Make sure that you can explain it plainly. You don't have to dance around issues. You can say it very plainly. Explain what other people are doing socially and help them understand that. So David Helfgott was a famous musician, and one of the things that he talked about in his understanding of music is that the notes are on the page, but the emotion is what I feel. So people on the spectrum can feel emotion deeply, but maybe they need to be empowered to feel that by something like music, something like connecting through art. There's a lot of wonderful art out there by people on the spectrum, very creative individuals. It's thought that Vincent van Gogh, he demonstrated a lot of attributes that would suggest that he is someone who would fit in that category of someone being on the autism spectrum. So Eileen Miller, who is famous for her art, has talked about how Einstein's definition of insanity, doing the same thing over and over again and getting the same result. He said, no, Mr. Einstein, that's not insanity. That's autism. Because a lot of times when you have a special interest as someone on the autism spectrum, you can lose time in that interest. That can become the main focus of your life. You hyper focus on that. You have an ability to do that a lot of those on the spectrum interpret as a superpower, and they should, because they're amazing. They can be amazing that way. I worked with one little guy who his mother really struggled with his autistic behaviors, like lining up his toys. So one of the ways that we helped him as a 6-year-old, he was hyperlexic, so he was learning to read and write, but he had a hard time putting a space between the words he was writing. So he would write a sentence and leave the spaces out. So we found a way to work around that. We would appeal to what he enjoyed doing, like lining up cars. Every time he wrote a word and he put a space between two words, he got to line up another car. So that's just an example of appealing to their interest. Okay, N, that narrow interest range. Few interests, but they dominate. They have these special interests. So encourage reading about those interests. When Spencer was about 9 years old, he became obsessed with the Beatles. Part of it had to do with his music, but part of his reason for wanting to become more skilled at playing music was because he was fascinated by the Beatles. So they kind of played off each other. So I got him a book this thick about the Beatles. That encouraged his reading. Use their special interest to teach social skills. So talk about what they see going on socially within their special interest. So if the kid's special interest is computers, talk about how they can connect with others, in a healthy way through the media. Talk about how, like with music, one of the things Spencer's really good at is making up songs off the top of his head about people. So that was a way he could connect with others through this special interest. An enriched environment is going to encourage broadening the interest range, and this can be incredibly challenging, especially if you're working with people living under the poverty line. So that can be more challenging to bring in a broader range of experiences. Make sure that you're protecting these individuals. Make sure you're aware that there are special dangers of early sexuality. especially when it comes to having a special interest that will dominate. A lot of the times their special interest dominates to the point that that's all they want to do. And so as little kids, they know, I want to play soldier. I don't want to play cowboys. So this is what we have to do because this is my special interest. So we have to figure out ways to give and take and help them see from the other person's perspective, which can be so challenging. One of the attributes Spencer had was clumsy motor skills. So make sure that the schedule's working for you. It's time to go to gymnastics, or it's time to do whatever skill it is. One of the things he did was he had swimming practice 3 times a week, and that really helped him in building coordination. Encourage them to try new things and consider what their special interest is. Appeal to that as a way to broaden it. So if they're interested in music, introduce several musical instruments, several different varieties of music. Take them to concerts with grandparents and other people that are going to appreciate them for who they are and still have a social connection. And of course, make sure that they practice. One of the things I would do with my kids is put practicing their piano on their chore list. And then it became something that was fun to do. One of the special interests there, he went through a stage where it was all about Star Wars. And one of the things that Tony Atwood said is that you can play Spot the Aspie at a Star Wars convention, right? You can also play it at my family reunions, that's for sure. Make sure that there is environmental predictability. Structure and routine is very important to these individuals. So when Spencer was a little guy, I would talk about the change before it happened so he could plan. Now, the plus side of having a mother with ADHD was that he kind of had no choice but learn how to be spontaneous. But I still recognized I needed to give him at least 10 minutes. If we were going to change the plan for the day, he needed some time to prepare. So you got to respect that. Communicate to them the reasons behind being spontaneous, the reason behind the change of plan, so that they can have a sense of control. It is exhausting. If you're working with parents of children on the spectrum, validate them for how exhausting it is, and challenge them to use humor. One of the things that Spencer, every morning, 6 a.m., he would stand over my bed and say, "Mom, breakfast." And I swear he did this for like 4 years straight. Every morning. He never got the joke because I got to the point where I would just answer back. He would say, "Mom, breakfast?" And I would answer back, "No, thanks." Every day, same thing. And he would say, "No, not you, me." But it's exhausting. It's exhausting, but we got to appeal to humor. R, rigidity of thought. Oh yeah, breakfast is at 6. Breakfast is when I'm hungry. When he was little in the summertime, lunch meant, if it was noon, it meant lunchtime, and lunch needed to be on the counter. And his sandwich cut the, so this mind blindedness, the inability to determine what others are thinking, the inability to think outside of this rigid perspective, taking things literally. They need time alone to reconstruct social interactions, to be able to rebuild what happened during that day. And like I said, Spencer would come home. Sometimes he'd go straight to the piano. He would start pounding away. And then after a while, he'd get mellower and mellower. And I could tell he had worked through the challenging situation of the day. With that rigidity of thinking, we have what we call velociraptors. They know everything about something. That rigid mindset. "Oh, you tricked me. This Traveling Pants movie doesn't have anything to do with car chases." It's kind of one of the things that Tony Atwood said is that people on the spectrum, the diagnosis that he had on the side was extremely male. And I thought that was hilarious because in our culture, women seem to be more likely to be the nurturers, seem to be more likely to get social situations than guys do, seem to be more social. But at the same time, the numbers show us that women struggle as much, but they don't get diagnosed as often. So that's something, again, we need to remember. keep them safe in talking about the birds and bees. I want to just touch on this. This is another whole presentation, but make sure that we're being concrete, that we're teaching our clients, that we're teaching the parents of kids on the spectrum to not talk about the birds and the bees, but talk about the penis or the vagina. Label their body parts correctly. This is going to protect them from sexual abuse. If something happens, they will be able to say penis. They will be able to say vagina, and they need to have those labels. That's empowering. Be consistent and repetitive about sexual safety. Find someone of the same gender to teach the basics of safety and hygiene, someone you can trust. Be sure to address the social dimension of sexuality. Strongly reinforce appropriate behaviors. Redirect inappropriate behaviors. Give them something to carry or hold if they're likely to be touching themselves inappropriately in public. Their vocabularies may be very advanced. A lot of these individuals have a very high intellect. They excel at thinking, like I said, thinking like a computer, thinking outside of the social connections that a lot of us that are more neurotypical may have. So an Asperger or an autistic child is like any other child. They need a lot of love and encouragement. It might be manifest differently. They might not want to be hugged and touched. We need to ask permission. We need to respect their boundaries. Make sure that the parents of these kids are getting the training that they need. One of the reasons we want to diagnose early is so that people have access to all of the things that can be provided for them. The resources. They need resources. We need social skills training, language therapy, sensory integration training for younger children, and psychotherapy, cognitive behavioral therapy for older children can be very helpful. These are the resources that I used. This is my favorite one currently. Love this book. I highly recommend it. And I'm coming out with a book myself. These are some of the my Facebook pages. When I find information about autism spectrum, parenting autism spectrum kids, I put it on my Facebook page, which is really easy to find. Parents of autism spectrum kids. So I'm just going to go ahead. I'm going to go ahead and give you the word that you need to get credit. And that is students, student, or I'm sorry, just one, student. So I'm going to go ahead and open this up to questions now. Does anybody have any questions or comments about autism spectrum disorder?
I have a question. I have several patients, but I also have a family friend's daughter who has been tested for autism spectrum disorder multiple times. She's only, let's see, I think she just turned 11 or 12, but they keep finding that she's just under the number of criterion for the diagnosis. However, she hits so many of the criterion and they affect her so strongly. And I'm wanting to be able to help guide her parents to help her either get the diagnosis or at least be able to act.
Okay. Yeah. So basically what you're saying is it's difficult to get the diagnosis. And what I hope I was able to communicate in this presentation is that I don't think the diagnosis is as important as understanding how to interact with these individuals, because you're going to have people in all walks of life and all ages. And, people of my generation are going to exhibit attributes of autism and have never been diagnosed. it wasn't even on the radar when I was a kid, you know. My son is now 24 years old. He was diagnosed he got a soft diagnosis as a 7-year-old, a hard diagnosis of high functioning autism, Asperger's syndrome back then, as a 9-year-old. But getting that diagnosis, we were living in Alaska at the time, and then we've lived in rural Nevada. There's not a lot of resources in some of these places. So I had to discover them on my own or create them. One of the best resources for me as a parent was just a parenting group with other people who had children on the spectrum. And I hear your frustration. It's very hard to get these kids the resources they deserve when they don't have that diagnosis. And I've actually had professionals come to me and say, you know, who can I send this individual to get a diagnosis? I just need to get the diagnosis so we have the paperwork. And for me, it was through the school system that I was able to finally get the hard diagnosis for my son. But even then, there wasn't a lot of resources provided. There's just that diagnosis. So those of you that live in more urban environments are going to have access to more. One of the things that we have here in Las Vegas is an agency called Glass House Counseling that has a connection with a resource that provides equestrian therapy. And I was privileged to do the behavioral therapy side of that for a while. Part of the big deal with getting the diagnosis is that Medicaid would only pay for the equestrian therapy if they had a diagnosis, and then they still had to do a half-hour behavioral therapy to get an hour on the horse. So it is a challenge, and I think the more we educate people with what autism is, you know, I think there's a lot of individuals out there that go undiagnosed because professionals want to see something else. And it's hard to, you know, I think part of it too is the negative label. So we need to step away from that. We need to step away from thinking that autism is a derogatory label. I love what's going on TikTok right now with the younger generation who is empowered by a diagnosis of autism. You know, and that's one of the things I tried to do with people I've worked with, like I demonstrated in my PowerPoint today, the hundreds and thousands of famous people like Mozart, like Bill Gates, people who have been very successful that demonstrate attributes of autism. And so did I answer your question? It's hard. I don't know that there's any easy answer. We're still evolving. You know, we're evolving as a soft science, as social workers. We're evolving as professionals in understanding what these diagnoses are. And I think the higher functioning, in some ways it's almost, I've had higher functioning individuals say, in some ways it's more challenging to be high functioning because it means easier, not necessarily. Sometimes high functioning means, yeah, I'm not as easy to diagnose, so I'm not going to get the resources I need.
Yeah, that's exactly what I find. And yes, you did answer the question. My connection to the session got cut off halfway, but I was able to get back on. So thank you much.
Did you have anything else that you were cut off from? No?
Oh, no, not myself. Thank you.
Okay. Are there any other questions or comments?
I have a question about when you're treating people who don't have a diagnosis yet and they're coming to you for individual therapy. I guess I just have a bit of an anxiety about, like, do I feel fully prepared? Am I the best person? So oftentimes I've been trying to refer out to agencies. Luckily, I'm in an area where there is a lot of different autism resources. But what is your suggestion for whether or not somebody who isn't specialized in this should continue trying or refer out? Like, which would you recommend?
Well, I think it sounds like you've got, is this Christine?
Yes.
Christine, you've got a little bit of imposter syndrome going on. You're a licensed social worker, right?
Yes.
Okay. You've taken this training, you know. I would highly recommend that you read some of the books that are out there, that you attend other trainings. Just go through the DSM-5, figure out what are the symptoms, and consider yourself a specialist. Get the credential that you need. If you need to get some special training that gives you that credential. I mean, I feel like I got it by raising my kid. and there's nothing like having a child to motivate you. I've had clients that have been able to get free of substance abuse issues because they did it for their child, but I would, take a look at yourself. Do you have some imposter syndrome going on? And study it and understand, and, allow yourself to be a specialist in that area if that's interesting to you. And if you see a need out there, and I'm telling you, there's a need. So,
Thank you.
Yeah, you go, girl. You've got this. Any other questions?
I have a question. I have a son, a 22-year-old son on the spectrum in college, and I also see a lot of young adults in my caseload, and it seems like the idea of launching gets complicated because, at least with my son, he doesn't like to ask for help. He's had so much help throughout his life. He wants to do it on his own, but he still needs support. And we come across that in our practice too, about kids at Northwestern, and we're in Evanston, Illinois. Same thing, they want to do it on their own, but they still need support, and they don't like to ask for help. So I don't know if you have any thoughts about that.
That is a challenge. A lot of these young people, they want to be independent. They see themselves as independent, but it's a rough world out there. and housing prices, just getting around can be challenging. You live in a challenging area. I have a son south of you, and that can be challenging. I think that for me, the 12-step program has helped a ton. Al-Anon, the sister program to AA, for those of us who care about someone who has an addiction issue, a lot of those ideas where you give someone, you respect them enough to be able to change themselves. But again, one of my key points was you can't change someone with autism, but you can give them a network of support. And I think taking your cues from him, which it sounds like that's what you're doing. You're taking your cues from him. So making that network, making it look like independence when maybe it's, independence with boundaries, right? So a bank account that he has access to that has limits, boundaries, a housing situation that maybe, I know I've seen a lot of families where, they've been, and not everybody can do this, but like a basement apartment or, turning a garage into living space or something where, or friends, renting, from a family friend that's not mom and dad might give them more of a sense of independence than the actual independence. And I hear you. And it's, as moms, you look at that 22-year-old, and I'm sorry, you still see the little 4-year-old that didn't even talk yet, right? And so it is so challenging. When people say the tough years of raising kids, I mean, I'm sorry, it's tougher after 18, in my opinion, especially when they're on the spectrum. Because then we have to start to trust that everything we did the first 18 years is going to kick in. And sometimes it's not. But one of the things that I've seen, both personally and professionally, is that a lot of these young people, if they were able to bond with someone in their growing up years, probably mom, sorry, but if mom was the main nurturer and caregiver, if they were able to bond effectively with you, they'll be able to do that with someone else, and they kind of need to, it depends on how high functioning they are. And high functioning, I mean, yeah, that means so much, doesn't it?
There's a spectrum too.
Yeah, it's loaded.
There's a spectrum of high functioning.
Yes, thank you. Right? Yeah, it's so challenging. My heart goes out to you, but I'm thinking, trust them as far as you can throw. Trust them within boundaries.
Right.
I always say to my court-ordered parenting clients, we don't raise children, we're raising adults. When they're babies, we bring them home, we put them in a crib that has real solid boundaries, and then those boundaries loosen up and loosen up and loosen up. And then when they're teenagers, those boundaries are trust. Do we trust that they can handle driving the car? Well, we teach them and train them so that we'll be able to, and then we loosen those boundaries. As we trust them, we can give them more trust, right? And so that can be part of the conversation, and also you can blame it on everybody else. I trust you, but I'm not sure I trust all the drunk drivers out there. I'm not sure I trust, I'm not sure I trust that neighborhood. I trust you. I'm not sure I trust that neighborhood or wherever, but yeah, I mean, you'll figure it out.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think boundaries are good.
Okay.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments?
I think your conversation about change, and that it's really not being able to really change. What I've seen with my son, he's 22. Maybe not so much change. Maybe it is, that same thing that you're talking about. But I have noticed that he's continuing to develop skills, which gives me so much hope that even though it's maybe not, maybe at the very base level, there's not going to be change with some things, but because he's continuing to develop skills, I have seen his ability to change with being able to cope or being able to do more things. So those areas where I thought that he wasn't going to be able to change, because his skill level still is developing, there has been change. And so that gives me so much hope. And so, I just kind of hold on to that.
I'm glad you mentioned that. Thank you. And my guy, 24 years old, he does live on his own. And, someone that would meet him today would not guess that he was ever diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder. And so I think, when we say they're not capable of change, what we mean is they're capable of growth. He still has the same mindset and the same funky ways of, the same quirkiness, but he has learned skills. And one of the theories is that, autism spectrum is frontal lobe damage. But as neurons grow in a child, and as we create new pathways through things like music and work that is satisfying, we do help them almost seem to recover, And so, I only talk in a professional setting about Spencer's autism, because among friends and family, he's just Spencer. And he's the person he is, and he's amazing, and everybody loves him. He's just a remarkable young person, and I'm incredibly proud of him. But I hear what you're saying. What I meant by that is, we don't want to assume that we can change them, but we can create a network of support to provide growth, and it can look like change. How does that sound?
Yeah, and I like what you just said about that neural pathways can be created through their interests. So even though it might look like they're, like for instance, my son is very much into Harry Potter and Disney, and Harry Potter is a little more on the more mature level from the Disney, but so he's taking books now, and he will listen to the audio tapes. And then he will actually look at the books and not even pretending, he is actually getting some of the dialogue. But he has a lot of confidence that he's actually looking at a book and he's reading. And so he sees mom and dad reading. Now he's reading and he loves it. And it's building his confidence and skill level. So instead of me and my husband sometimes becoming dismayed about the fact that, oh, do we have to talk about Harry Potter again? we're finding that there is a lot of gifts that are coming through.
Yeah, it's provided some growth for him. And it seems like that's what they're almost, they're striving for that. They're striving for growth through that special interest that they have. So, yeah, thank you for bringing that up. That was a really good point. Okay, it is 11:29. Thanks, everybody. I really enjoyed being here. And I look forward to learning more the rest of the day. So get out there and change the world and make a difference. Thanks for being the superheroes you are as social workers and reaching out to all those out there who struggle with autism spectrum. I appreciate it. Thank you.